Hey, good evening. This is Jacob Hornberger, and this is the Jacob Hornberger Show. Nice to be back with you guys. I'm president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, if you haven't watched the show before. Before we get started, I want to let you know that FFF is going to be in Reno, Nevada next week at the LPAC conference that's being sponsored by Ron Paul's Campaign for Liberty organization. Looks to be a great conference. I'll be giving a speech there, and we're going to have a panel, the Future of Freedom Foundation, with Bruce Fine and me, and it's going to be moderated by Jack Hunter. So we're going to be talking about the Constitution, the war on terrorism, civil liberties. My speech is going to be on foreign policy and the effect on civil liberties. So looks like a great conference. Details are on our website at fff.org on our FFF daily email update. If you're not subscribing to that, I highly invite you to do so. It's free for the asking. We'd like to think it's the best internet, best commentary editorial page from a libertarian perspective on the internet. And again, it's free for the asking. Just send us your email address at fff.org. I want to talk to you about a few things tonight. The drug war, that's in the news, even though, it's interesting. It's not part of the political debates taking place. I mean, it's absolutely phenomenal. I'll get to that in a second. I'm going to talk about the euro crisis, along with a little bit of Obama jobs. The big socialist project that Obama's got going to create jobs in America, and then a little bit about 9/11, a little commentary on the commemorations tomorrow and so forth. I started to say about the drug war. Notice that in all these debates and discussions, the whole topic is, who's going to create jobs better and who's going to better manage the economy, and there's a little bit about foreign policy, but the drug war should be a central part of the discussion that's taking place in this country. For one thing, it's horribly expensive, and everybody knows that the federal government is spending money like there was no tomorrow, borrowing the money, inflating the currency to pay off the debt. I mean, it's a deadbeat. It's a deadbeat organization. That's why it got, its credit rated downgraded by Standard & Poor's. Not because there was a budget crisis, a ceiling crisis debate there, a debt ceiling crisis. No, it's because they continue spending and borrowing to such a point that now the markets are wondering whether there's the possibility of default. And so what are they doing? They're just spending more and more money on this drug war. There's no debate. There's no discussion. I mean, this thing's gone on for 30 years, right? I mean, if there was ever a program that they could save money on and ditch and, oh, by the way, stop destroying so many lives with, and, oh, also put the drug lords and the drug cartels out of business instantaneously, it would be legalizing drugs. I mean, it's just like it's one of these permanent establishments in American life. At least that's what we're taught to believe. It's inculcated in us that the drug war is here. Get used to it. We don't care how much of a failure it is. We're going to just keep repeating the same old mantras. We're going to keep making record drug busts, and we're going to keep sending people into the penitentiary for the rest of their lives, or 10 years, or 30 years, or whatever. Doesn't matter. What matters is the jobs that are there. You see, they don't want to lay off people in the DEA and all the clerks and everybody whose job thrives on this, judges, and not just the kickbacks that people are on, the bribes, but just their salaries. They don't want to lay those people off. More unemployment. So, the taxpayers got to keep funding this thing. Well, it's back in the news. The drug war's on the front page of the New York Times. And this one deals with the drug war in Guatemala. The drug war is sort of, worldwide, but, it's driven mostly by the United States government. And, Guatemala, as I'm sure you know, if you've been listening to this show especially, Guatemala has a special relationship with the United States. Because remember, it was the CIA, which is an agency of the U.S. government, possibly the premier agency of the U.S. government, that went into Guatemala in 1954 and in a secret surreptitious regime change operation ousted the the democratically elected president of Guatemala. And that action, now the CIA, of course, considered it a great success because they were able to oust a head of state from a country, and they were able to install military dictators in Guatemala. I mean, there's something weird about the U.S. military and the CIA is they love when they effect these regime change operations, they love to install military types, or at least civilians that have a very big sympathy toward the military way of life. Well, in Guatemala, they just went for the military generals. The CIA just installed them, and that precipitated a 30-year civil war in Guatemala, where close to 1 million people were killed. And who were most of the people killed? Well, they were the people that were angry over this regime change operation. It was the same kind of anger that existed in Iran, and to a large extent still exists. 1 year previous to the Guatemalan regime change operation, the CIA had gone in and ousted the democratically elected prime minister of Iran, and that had generated anger. We still see the blowback from that experience. Well, in Guatemala, there was tremendous anger, civil war. And the military, which was now running the country with the full support of the U.S. military and the CIA, was just started massacring people and raping women and torturing people. I mean, all with the idea of that these were terrorists, these are communists, and people trying to oust a U.S.-supported regime. And so they were considered the bad guys. I mean, sounds familiar, right? Well, let me read you the first paragraph of this New York Times article. They burned villages, killed children, and just a winding road away from here in 1982 in Coban, Guatemala, the Guatemalan military also massacred hundreds of Mayan peasants after torturing old men and raping young women. And well, the article goes on to say that what's going on in Guatemala is that Guatemalans are now demanding the unthinkable. That's what the article says. A strong military back in their communities. In other words, we set aside all the rapes and the massacres and the horrible human rights abuses from these military personnel, many of them who had been trained at the School of the Americas of the U.S. Army. We're going to set all that aside. And why? Well, because of the drug war. People are tired of the violence of the drug war, the drug cartels, the drug lords, and so they want to crack down. And what better organization to crack down in the war on drugs than the military? You see, people, they get to a point in these crises that they say that we want the man on the white horse. We want the dictator. We want the military regime in order to establish peace and stability, or as the dictators say, and as U.S. officials often say, order and stability. You hear that phrase a lot in the Middle East. Order and stability, which is why the U.S. government has supported and partnered with dictatorships in the Middle East. Syria, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt. The list goes on and on. That the dictatorships provide order and stability. Well, that's what's now going on in Guatemala. Now, a lot of the young people there, which may well form more than 50% of the population, they don't remember the rapes and the abuses and the torture and so forth that ended up killing 1 million people. They just see all this violence in the drug war, so they take the reaction of, hey, we got to crack down. Well, guess what? That's what's been going on in Mexico. 5 years ago, the president comes into power and he says, we need to crack down in the war on drugs. And this is all encouraged by the DEA, the CIA, the U.S. military. Crack down. We're going to win this war on drugs. This has been going on for 30 years. You hear Americans talking like this, right? Oh, boy, if we could just send the troops to the border, that would clean up this drug war once and for all. Let's crack down. Well, in Mexico, we all know what the results are. There's, 35, 40,000 people dead now in 5 years. Imagine. I mean, we're talking about the war on terrorism and stuff. This war on drugs, 35, 40,000 people dead in the war on drugs. And then in many parts of Mexico, people are demanding that the military exit their region. Why? Because the military does what militaries do everywhere. They do what they do in Iraq and Afghanistan. They barge down people's doors. They search people's homes and belongings. They're looking for every drug they can find. They're looking for every weapon they can find, including the weapons that, of course, the ATF shipped down into Mexico. And so you've got these horrible human rights abuses where the military's power is essentially omnipotent. I mean, there's no control in the military. And, of course, a lot of them are on the take, too. The politicians are on the take. So the Mexican people are saying, get out of here. You know, we'll deal with the drug cartels. And that's what's going to happen in Guatemala. I mean, it happens everywhere. When you've got a military in there with law enforcement powers, they're going to do really bad things. This is one of the reasons, by the way, that we have that posse comitatus law here in the United States. That you know, Americans have a tradition of saying, we don't want the military involved with law enforcement. We know what militaries do when they get involved in law enforcement. Stay out, butt out. That's been our tradition. Now, that tradition's being eroded by people that are feeling the same way they are in Guatemala, the same way they are in Mexico. They're tired of the violence. They're tired of the drug lords. They're tired of the drug gangs. They're tired of the drug dealing. And they want that man on the white horse. They want that military general. They want those troops down there that are following orders, and they clean up, you know, the process. So you see this mindset here in America, too, that's eroding, that's slowly overwhelming the posse comitatus and the philosophy of posse comitatus that says we don't want the military involved in this thing. In fact, you know, it's interesting, you know, somewhat hypocritical when you see that the American people say we don't want the military involved in drug enforcement or law enforcement in the United States, and yet we permit the military to go into Latin America and engage in law enforcement. And the U.S. military is a major factor. So is the CIA, the DEA, in getting the military involved in enforcing drug laws in Mexico, in Guatemala. I mean, the U.S. government is encouraging them to use the military. Isn't that ironic when over here we say it's a horrible thing that the military is involved in law enforcement? Oh, it's not so horrible a thing over there. Well, of course it is. But what's sad is that the Guatemalan people, I would say 99% of whom have had their mindsets inculcated in the public schools, the government-run schools, never even conceive that there's another alternative. And I'm sure there's some, because there's a big libertarian presence in Guatemala. There's a great university there called Francisco Marroquin University. It's been there for many, many years. It was founded by a man, Manuel Ayau, who was ardent libertarian, uncompromisingly libertarian. He was actually on the board of trustees at the Foundation for Economic Education. I went down to Francisco Marroquin and I gave some lectures there. Pure, hardcore, no compromise libertarian lectures. It was a great time. And they have rooms devoted to Mises there, and Hayek and Bastiat, and it's a phenomenal place. It's like this little oasis of freedom in this gigantically statist nation. And so not everyone's a statist there, but by and large, the masses, the population is public school educated. So they just do what Americans do. They accept as given that the drug war's there, and it never even enters their mind that it's the drug war that has produced the cartels, that has produced the drug lords. That connection doesn't enter their minds, because in the public schools they were sent, that's never addressed. It's just, you know, the same kind of stuff we get in public schools here. The drug war is essentially part of our free society. It is a permanent part of our free society. And the drug war exists to exterminate the drug lords and the drug cartels and drugs from society. And so, of course, you know, we libertarians have broken through. You know, a few conservatives, a few liberals have broken through and realized that it's the drug war itself that has produced the cartels. That if you ended the drug war, If you ended this nonsense, if you legalized drugs, there'd be no more drug lords, no more drug cartels. And so it's really sad because these people in Guatemala, they clearly want their society to be peaceful, harmonious, without these violent drug gangs and drug lords, but they don't know how to get there. They think that the way to get there is to crack down, when actually the only way to get there, if you want to get rid of the drug lords and the drug cartels, there's only one way to do it. And that way would do it instantaneously. If you legalize drugs today, if you admitted that the drug war has been a horrible, horrible failure, an immoral failure, as big a failure as prohibition of alcohol, then you get rid of that war, then you restore the peace and harmony of a society and get rid of the violence, the gang wars, the killings, the bribery, the corruption. Sure, that's going to hurt the judges and the prosecutors and the law enforcement officials who are on the take, because there's no more drug lords to put them on the take. It hurts them because they're no longer needed, so they got to get out and get jobs in the private sector. They can't just rely on the dole of the drug war, welfare state, where tax monies are paying for their salaries. They're no longer needed. Okay, just like Al Capone, when Al Capone was put out of business, well, they got him on an income tax violation. But when all his ilk was put out of business with alcohol legalization, you no longer needed the alienesses. Their jobs were just, superfluous, unnecessary. And that's the only solution. It's just what's so sad is the Mexican people don't realize this. The Guatemalan people don't realize this. A lot of the American people don't realize this. Now, that's not to say that people are not waking up to this. I mean, it's incredible. The number of people that are now calling for drug legalization, at least in this country, is incredible. I mean, you go Google it, end the drug war or drug legalization. You'll be amazed at how many op-eds and editorials, and including by federal judges, state judges, police. There's a police organization calling for the end of the drug war. It's called LEAP. You can Google that. Because they're realizing that this is an idiotic war. It's a waste of resources. Cops getting killed for nothing. People getting killed for nothing. They're recognizing that drug addiction's no different from alcoholism. It's a social problem. It's a psychological problem. It's a problem best dealt with therapy and that sort of thing, counseling, but not the military approach to drug addiction or the DEA approach. It's clearly that's a total failure. And so the good news is the libertarian perspective on this thing we've been fighting for, a lot of people are breaking through. And you at least have Ron Paul and Gary Johnson, two presidential candidates for the Republican ticket, that are calling for ending the drug war. And they're getting, tremendous support out there. I mean, you can see how well Ron's doing. And from what I understand, Gary Johnson's rising in the polls. And people know what their positions are on the drug war. So that's the bright side of this. I've often said that when the welfare state, when people finally realize that the problems that we're facing in this country are rooted in the welfare state, the paternalistic welfare state, and the warfare state, the national security state, the garrison state, whatever label you want to put on it, that the first thing is likely to go is the drug war. Because the defenders of the drug war have nothing left in their arsenal. 20 years ago when I heard all these arguments, and I was living on the border, my hometown of Laredo. I mean, you want to see drug war par excellence, go to a border town. There's drug warriors everywhere. Border Patrol, DEA, undercover cops. I didn't see any military down there doing it, but, it wouldn't have surprised me. But, I mean, the town is filled with Border Patrol and DEA and stuff. And I heard all these mantras. Oh, your victory's right around the corner. All the stuff they're saying today. I heard it 20 years ago, or more when I was practicing law back in the late 1970s. I guess that's 30 years. Wow. I heard it all. And yet things have got progressively worse every time they've cracked down. When I was a kid, we used to go into Mexico on dates and stuff. It was just across the border. You have one big metropolitan area in Laredo divided by a river. It's Nuevo Laredo and Laredo. And the metropolitan area comes right up to the river, to the international bridges there. And so, we'd go on dates. A lot of times our parents didn't approve, but, well, we won't go down that road about sometimes the rules are broken when you're a teenager. But we'd go across the river on dates. We'd go into nightclubs. We'd drink, and we'd have a good time. And tourists were coming in and going to the market and getting a taste of old Mexico. And the cultures are remarkably different, even just on a border two border towns like that. And the whole border region's a different culture from the rest of the United States. A fascinating way of life. But it was fun. People would go into Mexico and have fun. No more. I mean, my cousins down there tell me that nobody goes across the river. The tourism business is dried up. It's too violent. People are getting kidnapped and killed and so forth. I mean, it's really sad. It's all because of the drug war. And so, my message to the Guatemalan people, just in case there's somebody from Guatemala here, is legalize drugs. Don't listen to the U.S. government on this. They're leading you down the wrong road. Don't follow Mexico's path. Just legalize drugs, okay? To heck with what the U.S. government says. All right, you may lose some foreign aid. Big deal. You can do without it. It's just all that's just welfare for foreign regimes. It makes you dependent on it, just like it makes welfare-dependent people dependent over here in the United States. They're going to threaten you with cutting off your federal aid. So be it. You're better off without it. And legalize drugs. End the drug war in your country, and you will be much better off. You will have a peaceful, harmonious society in terms of no more drug lords, no more drug cartels, drug gangs, violence, bribery, and so forth. Okay, let's move on to another subject. Let's talk about this euro crisis. This is really interesting because this thing could spill over to the United States, and the U.S. officials are now starting to acknowledge that. The New York Times reported today that a German official just resigned from the European Central Bank, and people are saying that is something really gigantic. That it's sending that man is sending a message. Now, he didn't give the real reasons. I think he said something like, "I'm leaving for personal reasons," but everybody suspects that's not the real reason he's leaving. That they suspect that the real reason that this man has resigned from the European Central Bank is that the bank is now moving into the area of what U.S. officials have been telling them to do. And that is start inflating your currency in order to liquidate or reduce your debt. You see, what's been going on? I mean, if you've listened to my show, you know the sort of the background of this. That the Greek government is much like the U.S. government. In fact, the U.S. government copied the welfare state idea under the regime of Franklin Roosevelt from the Europeans. I mean, the socialistic welfare state originated in among German socialists at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. And that idea gradually was imported to the United States with the progressives, and it became a full-force revolutionary paradigm under the regime of Franklin Roosevelt. So Europe's had this statism a lot longer. And in Greece, they've just kept spending and spending and spending far in excess of the amount of money they were bringing in taxes, and they would just borrow the difference. So they end up with this huge debt crisis. They can't pay their debts. They're deadbeats. And, the secret, of course, is just to dismantle their welfare payments. But they can't do it. You see, this is what's so fascinating, that the people on the dole are as insistent on receiving their dole as the people here in the United States. I mean, you know what happens when they talk about the Social Security recipients? I mean, boy, those seniors get all upset and uptight, and they're ready to hit the streets. They may be walking with canes and whatever. They're going to be out there protesting wildly, writing nasty letters like, "You ain't going to cut my dole. You're not going to cut my dole." Same thing with Medicare. Same thing with Medicaid. The farm subsidies, the education grants. These are bureaucracies that are going to fight viciously. We've seen in this country, nobody wants to let go of their dole. Over here, it's compounded with the warfare state, the military-industrial complex. They're fiercely fighting for no reduction in their dole. It's no different in Greece. Anybody that thinks that Greece is going to reduce government spending, forget it. It ain't going to happen. Those people on pensions, on free health care, free education, free this and free that, there is no way the politicians are going to stand up to them any more than the politicians here are going to stand up to the dole recipients here. So the spending's going on. The debt is going on, just like it's here. You know how the debt ceiling was raised? They don't have debt ceilings over there. They just keep spending and spending, and they don't have to go through this charade of calling it a debt ceiling and keep borrowing and borrowing. Well, the Greeks, the dole recipients there say, well, we want the Germans and the Americans to subsidize our payments over here. That we don't have enough tax revenues. We've got a lot of dole payments that have to be made, and we don't want to reduce any of this, but we got to make the difference up. We can't borrow anymore because nobody wants to lend us any money. So we want the Americans who are rich and the Germans who have kept their welfare state within constraints, and not to a total extent, but to a much better extent than the Greeks have. We want their taxpayers to continue funding the difference. And sure enough, the U.S. government helped fund you, the taxpayer. I mean, you're the one that sends your money to the IRS. The IRS turns it over to the people that send the money to the, IMF, World Bank, whatever, and that money's then funneled into the Greek pensions, their bank accounts and so forth. Well, the Germans are catching the brunt of this. The Germans have a long history, at least since World War I, of understanding that the hazards of printing the money to pay off this debt. I mean, that's what the Federal Reserve is doing now. That's what the Federal Reserve has done for decades. As the spending and the borrowing has increased ever since the Franklin Roosevelt administration, the Fed's job has been to pay off that debt and accommodate the debt and accommodate the spending by just printing the money. Well, in Europe, they couldn't do that because the Germans were standing in their way. The Germans know what this inflationary business is all about. It doesn't produce prosperity. You can't produce prosperity with printing paper money. If that were the case, Zimbabwe would be, tremendously prosperous. But yet you still have the statists here in the United States, especially in the liberal community, saying, oh, the secret's to print the money, stimulate the economy. Well, the Germans had that experience in World War I, where they had hyperinflation from printing the money to try to pay off the debts and the spending and so forth. And the prices were, you'd go in to buy a loaf of bread with a wheelbarrow, and by the time you left, you needed, 3 wheelbarrows to buy the bread. Prices were soaring that fast. So the Germans said, we're going to establish a sound currency, and that was the German mark. And I remember when this euro thing was going through, and I said to people, the Germans are stupid, they're crazy. Why are they giving up this solid currency, the German mark? It was like the Swiss franc. And getting involved in this eurozone with all these profligate governments, that they're known for their out of control spending. The Italians, the Spanish, the Greeks, and but the Germans held fast in the central bank. They said, no, we're not going to print the money to do this. And the American officials, the U.S. officials have been saying, just print the money. That's what we're doing. That's what you ought to do. And, of course, the Chinese they're players in this thing as far as the Americans are concerned, because they're the largest foreign creditor of the United States. Yeah, the Chinese communists, if you can believe that. And they're telling the U.S. government, don't even think of doing that this time, because we're now the ones that are going to get stung. Well, the Germans are saying, we're not going to participate in this. You're not going to do this. That you just need to slash your spending. And the Greeks, they keep saying they're going to do it, but we all know they're not going to do it. Why should they do it if the dole recipients in America aren't going to do it? And you can see they're not doing it here in the United States. So this guy resigns, and that's a signal that they're they're already buying these bonds up. The European Central Bank is buying these bonds up, and when they come due, the idea is we just print the money to pay off the debt. And so this guy resigns, and that's an ominous sign. The euro's crashing. But what's interesting in the cross-currency rates, the dollar's been crashing against the euro. Now the euro's crashing. Well, they're both crashing, and guess how that's being reflected? Well, yeah, duh, in the price of gold. Because now these two currencies, in relationship to gold, they're crashing The price in terms of dollars and euros of gold is soaring, and we all see that. And of course, the statists hate that. I saw an article the other day where a guy's proposing regulating the gold market because he says this could be the new bubble, like the housing bubble. I mean, of all the ludicrous things. And then I thought, the guy can't be that dumb. No, that what he's doing, he's trying to figure out a rationale for the government to get involved in the gold market, seize it like Roosevelt did, price controls or whatever, anything to disguise the soaring price of gold so that because people always recognize that and say government's up to no good. A soaring gold price is a signal to people, to the masses, that government is up to no good, and the statists hate that. So they attack gold, they attack the speculators, they attack the leakers, they attack investors, anybody that is exposing what government is doing. So a German guy is taking over, and he may be just as good as the previous guy. Some people are hoping that he is, but it's an ominous sign that now the European Central Bank is going to take the same approach that U.S. officials are taking, the Obama regime, with the full support of both Democrats and Republicans. Federal Reserve, print the money. European Central Bank, print the money. I mean, the Federal Reserve is simply America's central bank, and its purpose from the very beginning. They said, to stabilize the money supply. Give me a break. The purpose of the Federal Reserve has always been to print the money to accommodate out-of-control spending, out-of-control debt for both the welfare state and the warfare state. For a while, the Germans have held the line on the euro, on printing the euro, and saying, no, you need to just abolish these pensions and dismantle this welfare state thing and so forth. They ain't doing that. And so now it looks like the U.S. is getting its way. They're going to print up more and more euros to pay off this debt. And so you're going to see I think you're going to see some real currency crises coming up. Now, I can't tell you what the timing is, but this thing cannot end pretty. Now, what's happening over here? Well, remember when we just had a debt ceiling crisis, a couple months ago or so, where, the argument was we don't want government adding more debt, that it's already got enough debt. Each American owes some $45,000 on average. That's your proportionate share. If you got a family of four, you owe $170,000, $180,000. That the idea of the debt ceiling is you can't add any more debt, which means you've got to start living within your means, and that's why many of us were opposing the lifting of the debt ceiling, that make the government just live off the tax revenues that came in. And people say, there'd be a default. No, not necessarily. They have to prioritize their expenditures in accordance with how much money they're bringing in. And they were already planning, the paper was reporting, that their top priority was to keep making debt payments with the money that was coming in, which would have been fine. Now, what do they do with the money that's left over? There's obviously not going to be enough to pay the Social Security recipients, the Medicare people, the farm subsidies, the foreign aid to dictatorships. That's a big portion of it. The drug war. Well, they'd have to start dismantling some of these things, ending some of these things. Yeah, I mean, isn't that what a family does? Okay, so they raised the debt ceiling and said, okay, well, we're going to let Obama borrow another $2.7 trillion. More debt added on to the previous debt. Well, what did I say was going to happen? I said they're going to celebrate. The statists are going to celebrate. The New York Times, the Washington Post, all the mainstream commentators that were saying the sky is falling if the debt ceiling's not raised. What did I say? That they're going to be saying happy days are here again. And that's what they're saying. Happy days are here again. Because now they've got a 2-year window now where they know there's a debt ceiling up ahead, right? There's now you can't borrow more than that ceiling 2 years from now. So wouldn't you think they'd say, well, okay, we barely got by this last time, but now we've got this ceiling. it cannot be raised because it's a ceiling coming up in 2 years. We've got to start abolishing departments. We need to start dismantling agencies. We need to get down to where we're living within our means, and even more so we can start using the revenues to start paying down the debt. They're not doing anything like that. They're not doing anything. And I guarantee you, 2 years from now, I'm going to be there saying, when they're saying, got to lift the debt ceiling, got to lift the debt ceiling, I'm going to say, wait a minute, status. Didn't I tell you that for the last 2 years you should have been dismantling these spending programs? You should have been abolishing departments and agencies in order to live within your means and go even further than that in order to start paying down the debt? Haven't I been telling you that? Didn't you know that for the last 2 years? Because we're going to go through this charade 2 years from now. And we see this with this Obama jobs bill. Now, what's he proposing? $450 billion more in spending for a jobs bill in order to reduce unemployment? You see, what these people, these statists, they just cannot recognize is the distinct possibility, the reality, that it is the welfare state that is responsible for the economic woes, including the unemployment. They cannot understand that that's the problem, the welfare state, along with the warfare state, which I'll talk about in a minute. But here we got the welfare state. In their mind, it's inconceivable, just inconceivable, that the welfare state's the root of the problem. And so they say, well, unemployment, it's got to be free enterprise, the failure of the free enterprise system. Isn't that what they said, in the Great Depression, that free enterprise had failed? Isn't that what they always say? They blame it on greed and the banksters. That's the favorite one, the banksters and the speculators and the selfish people and the rich. Oh, don't forget the rich. But it's never, ever, it doesn't even enter their minds that it's the welfare state. The same with the drug war. They don't connect that the drug cartels and the drug warriors, the gangs, the violence is a direct result of the drug war, this federal government program. It's the same with the welfare state. They cannot conceive of the fact that unemployment is a direct consequence of this massive welfare state interventionist society that we've had ever since the realm of Franklin Roosevelt. Now, I would love for Obama to go talk to Fidel Castro. I mean, it would be fantastic because Fidel Castro had an unemployment problem too. His philosophy is no different in principle from that of Obama's, his economic philosophy. And a government manager of the economy. And so you had Fidel Castro managing the economy in Cuba. You got Obama managing the economy here. I mean, they both believe in this central management of economies as compared to us libertarians, where we believe in free markets, decentralization, no government management of the economy. Let people manage their own economic affairs. The spontaneous order, as Hayek called it. Well, what did Castro do? Well, he did more of what Obama's doing. What's Obama doing? He's using the government to hire people. Okay, he's spending money. Money he doesn't have, but he's going to go hire people. He's going to expand this public works project. He's going to build some roads over here. He's going to dig some ditches over here. He's going to hire these people who are unemployed. Well, that's what Castro did. But Castro took it to its logical conclusion. I mean, ask yourself, why doesn't Obama just hire all the unemployed people? I mean, just spend whatever is necessary, Mr. Obama. Hire all the unemployed people in the country. Well, that's what Castro did. But Castro took it to its logical conclusion. He gave jobs to everybody. Imagine, the government gave jobs to everybody in Cuba. There's no more unemployment. Hasn't been any. Everybody works for the government. I mean, isn't that fascinating? I mean, Obama's sort of a piker. He says, well, I'm going to hire a certain number of people for the government. But, he doesn't hire all the unemployed. And of course, if he did, then there'd gradually be more unemployed every day because of the economic crisis that develops from the massive monstrosity role that the federal government's playing in economic activities. And, oh, by the way, if they had that conversation, Fidel Castro and Obama, Obama would say, well, how are you doing here in Cuba? Castro would respond, oh, it's great. We got free retirement for everybody, Social Security. We got free health care for everybody, Medicare and Medicaid. We got free education all the way through college for everybody. You know, Castro would say, I heard you guys only go through 12th grade, you know. And he'd say, and everybody's very prosperous here. Well, it would be a lie. There's desperation, almost on the verge of starvation in Cuba. I've been there. I've seen it. And you know, people hate it there. In terms of the economic conditions, they hate it. They like Fidel Castro. They like the fact that he stood up against the United States, that he's still willing to stand up against the regime change operations of the CIA, you know, the assassinations, the invasions, the acts of terrorism that the CIA and the U.S. military, the American military industrial complex, the national security state did to Cuba. They respect Castro for that. I talk to people, the people on the street, but they hate the socialism, and because they know they've been left behind economically. And unfortunately, Obama's never gotten that message. Well, liberals have never gotten that. Conservatives have never gotten that message. They believe in Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, education grants, aid to dictatorships. You know, it goes on, this whole welfare state edifice. And it can't end well. I mean, ask the Cuban people, ask the Greek people, ask anybody that has suffered under socialism, and they will tell you. Ask the Zimbabweans about out of control printing of money. You can't create prosperity through the printing of money. I mean, if you could, Castro would be wealthy, Cuba would be wealthy, North Korea would be wealthy. Their currencies are in the dirt. And the only way you can make a nation wealthy and prosperous is what Adam Smith said when he wrote that great book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. And that's through the private accumulation of capital, where people are free to keep everything they earn. They save a portion of that. That goes into productive capital. Businessmen borrow that money through banks. They make their equipment more productive. That makes the workers more productive. That increases productivity. That increases revenues. That increases wage rates. It's the only way that wealth can rise in a society. Let's talk about the other side of this thing, the warfare state. And that brings up, of course, the big 9/11 memorial things tomorrow. You know, everybody's going to be focusing on 9/11. I mean, the history starts with 9/11. 9/11 changed the world. You know, we're going to hear all the mantras. And because, you know, they don't want to think before 9/11. An example of this phenomenon was like in the the presidential debate before last, when Senator Santorum says, history begins in Iran with 1979, the revolution, where they ousted the Shah of Iran from power and they took our diplomats hostage. You see, for him, that's where it starts, where these people did these horrible things to the U.S. and then they ended up putting in this Islamic regime. Well, as Ron Paul pointed out, I mean, you know, thank goodness there's one libertarian on that stage, because the others, they looked at, they're like zombies. You know, Ron Paul says, no, it doesn't start with 79. It starts with 53, when the CIA, get this, goes into this country and secretly and surreptitiously instigates a coup d'etat, where they oust the democratically elected president of Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh. This man was Time Magazine's Man of the Year. He was renowned all over the world. And they oust him from power to put a dictator in. A dictator that takes the next 25 years torturing his people. His torture team was trained by the CIA. And finally, people had enough of the indefinite detentions, the torture, the incarcerations, the suppression of dissent, and they had a revolution. Okay, well, that's how we have to analyze 9/11. You know, the statists say, let's not go before 9/11. Let's not go prior to 9/11. You got to go prior to 9/11, because what happened prior to 9/11 is what engendered the anger and hatred and rage that manifests itself in this terrorist retaliation, the terrorist blowback, as the CIA called it. And that's critical for an understanding here, that once the national security state that had been in existence since 1946, the National Security Act came into existence in 47, the CIA, the military-industrial complex, once they lost their official enemy in 1989, the Soviet Union, who had been their friend, partner, and ally during World War II, they don't dismantle, just like NATO didn't dismantle. That was the time to dismantle. That was why they had justified the national security state, this monstrosity of a military industrial complex, a empire overseas, hundreds of bases and more than 100 countries and invasions and occupations. They go and they stir up hornets' nests in the Middle East, and that included the Persian Gulf intervention, where they killed countless Iraqi people, and then they destroyed the water and sewage facilities in Iraq at the height of those battles, knowing with the intent that it would spread infectious illnesses among the Iraqi people. They imposed brutal sanctions for 11 years that prevented those water and sewage facilities from being repaired, so people were drinking dirty water during that time. And they had the infamous no-fly zones that were illegal, never had been approved by anybody, not even the UN, much less the Congress. They were killing people there. They were humiliating Muslims in the region by stationing U.S. troops near Islamic holy lands, Mecca and Medina. They had the unconditional financial support to the Israeli government and military support. And then they were supporting dictators, too. They were supporting both sides in the Arab conflict. They were giving money to the dictatorship in Egypt and armaments. The Pentagon was working well with them. And so you had this rage taking place, and it was magnified when Madeleine Albright, the official spokesman for the U.S. government before the world body, the United Nations, she tells 60 Minutes when they ask her, are the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children from the sanctions? Because they were drinking that dirty water, and they were dying from it. In multitudes that just shock the conscience. They asked her, is the death of 500,000 children worth it, Ms. Albright? And she was speaking on behalf of the U.S. government. She said, yes, it's a difficult decision, but yes, the deaths of those children are worth it. Well, you cannot imagine the anger that went up in the Middle East over this. I mean, not just among the Iraqi people, but people all over the Middle East. That's why Dick Cheney, I'm convinced, was convinced, even to this day is convinced, that Iraq was part of 9/11. Because he was so convinced that since they were killing the children in Iraq with these sanctions, that it had to be the Iraqi people that were involved in 9/11. I mean, it just stands to reason. But what he didn't recognize, it was people all over the region. They were angry and outraged when they caught a guy named Ramzi Youssef in '93 who attacked the World Trade Center with a terrorist attack. Same terrorist target as in 2001. They treated it as a criminal justice problem, which they should have done instead of this military approach that's been going on for 10 years. And they waited the guy out. They finally caught him in Pakistan. They didn't go in and drop a bunch of bombs and kill a bunch of wedding parties and so forth as they've done in Afghanistan, Iraq, and so forth. They didn't kill anybody. They just arrested this guy, brought him back to trial, prosecuted him, convicted him at his hearing, his sentencing hearing before the federal judge. You can go online, you can look at it. It is incredible. You just sense the rage in this man, and it's all directed to U.S. foreign policy, what the U.S. government was doing there. And then you got the attacks on the USS Cole, on the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. And finally, in 9/11, those of us at the Future Freedom Foundation, we were saying before 9/11, you're going to see a terrorist attack on U.S. soil. Mark our words. Unless the U.S. government stops doing what it's doing in the Middle East. We weren't the only ones. Get a great book by Chalmers Johnson called Blowback. In fact, get all of his books, all 4 of his books. They're fantastic. Read his articles online. If you don't want to spend money for the books, read his articles online. Just Google Chalmers Johnson. But he was saying there's going to be a terrorist attack before 9/11. It was called Blowback from what the U.S. government was doing in the Middle East. So 9/11 comes along and people say, oh, change the world, change the world. It didn't change anything with respect to the federal government because the federal government used 9/11 to continue doing what they had been doing before. Regime change operations. Iran, Guatemala, Cuba, they had tried to do a regime change operation there. So they go into Afghanistan, they effect a regime change operation there. They put in a brutal dictatorial regime, fraudulent to the hilt, crooked and corrupt, and they call that freedom. In Iraq, they've done the same thing. You got the crooked, corrupt, a regime that's torturing people, barging down people's doors with the help of the U.S. military, no warrants, no nothing, just grabbing men that are look up to be of fighting age because they might be part of the resistance to this occupation, cart them away, put them in a military camp forever, or send them to Guantanamo. Not exactly a free country, but they call it a free country. The statists say that because of these invasions, Iraq and Afghanistan are now free, which is really ominous because this is a regime where the government's torturing its own people in both countries. Crooked, corrupt, barging down doors, no warrants, no due process, indefinite incarceration, torture, and the statists are saying that freedom has arrived in these two countries, which is ominous. Because if that's what they consider freedom, and it really is, I have no doubts that they really believe that the Iraqi people and Afghan people are now free. That's the kind of freedom that they're imposing over here. And that's the legacy. What changed was not the U.S. government. It goes into Iraq and gets what it had tried to do with the 11 years of sanctions, regime change, where they were trying to get rid of Saddam after partnering with Saddam, the same way they've partnered with Mubarak, the same way they've partnered with the Syrian dictator Assad, the same way they've partnered with the Libyan dictator Gaddafi to torture people. Well, they partnered with Saddam Hussein, and then they turned on him the same way they turned on Assad and Mubarak and Gaddafi. They have these partnerships that are dictators, and then they just turn against them. And I don't know how they choose between which dictators are going to be their friends. They're still friends and supporting the dictators in Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Bahrain, Yemen. I don't know how they make these decisions. My only point is they shouldn't be supporting any dictatorships. We ought to be terminating this federal aid to everybody, to every foreign regime. We don't have the money to do it anyway. So, and it's immoral to the hilt to be supporting torturers and dictators and tyrants. What's flabbergasting to me is that the American people, just the meekness, the acceptance of all this junk since 9/11, the torture partnerships. There's not that sense of anger and rage of what do you mean my government's involved in this? When I was growing up, I was always taught to believe that it was people like the Nazis that tortured people, that it was the communists that did this, that it was the barbarians in the old days. I went to a torture museum in Italy, in Siena, Italy, and I walked through this thing, and it was just gruesome. Well, that's what these people are doing. Gaddafi and Assad, they're taking fingernails off of people. They're using electrodes on their private parts, and that's who the U.S. government has partnered with. They were delivering people into the clutches of these dictators to do those kind of things to people. And what's amazing to me is just the blahness, the blaseness, the nonchalantness among Americans. It's just shocking to me. And so the U.S. government, it just continued doing more of the same. It used 9/11, when it said, oh, they hate us for our freedom and values, so we need to go in there and start invading and doing regime change and assassinating people. Our government is now the biggest assassination program in the world, probably in history. It's absolutely phenomenal. And what's changed, of course, is with respect to our freedom. I mean, it's really funny. I saw a quote by Giuliani today where Giuliani says, well, after 9/11, we came together and we come together as a free country. And then supporting all the powers the dictators in the Middle East are employing right here in the United States. And that's what was phenomenal. That's what changed, is that the U.S. government, headed by the president, started assuming the same emergency powers as the dictators that they were supporting. I mean, it was incredible. Indefinite detention, the power to cart people away as enemy combatants, as terrorists. Don't give them a trial. Just take them to a dungeon and torture them. Kill people, including Americans. Those powers were all assumed by George W. Bush. He didn't even go to the legislature like the Middle East dictators had gone. At least they went to the legislature. The president just says, I'm a commander-in-chief. and I'm at war. I'm at war against the terrorists. And now we're going to have the option of treating the terrorists either as enemy combatants, where I can do whatever I want, or actually as military forces, and the CIA can do whatever they want to them, or I can treat them as a criminal defendant. And so they've had this double track. It's the most bizarre thing in the world. And it's totally befuddled the statists that support them, that say, well, it's really good that we treated these terrorists as enemy combatants and warriors. And, you know, like there's this disconnect. Hello, they're still treating them as criminal defendants, you statist. Don't you understand that? They have an option now of treating them as a criminal defendant or as an enemy combatant that they can go out and torture and assassinate. And Americans thought, oh, well, this will just be on foreigners, no problem. Hello, they have all those powers on Americans, the same emergency dictatorial powers that the Egyptian people revolted against. Remember when they were demanding that Mubarak lift his emergency powers for 30 years, and Mubarak said, no, we've got a terrorist problem, we've got a drug war problem. Sound familiar? We've had these emergency powers, same powers, here in this country by the president for 10 years now. And they're now telling us that they have to last as long as Mubarak had them, at least for another 20 years, or at least indefinitely. It's incredible. This is the legacy of this thing. And so where do we go from here? Well, the military is saying they're saying the same thing the DEA is saying. We're here to stay. We're a permanent part of this thing. You know, the military-industrial complex, all the companies, the corporatism that are dependent on the military largesse, the contracts. You got occupations of two countries. And let me tell you something. The solution to this thing is not just to get out of Iraq and Afghanistan. The solution here is to start talking about dismantling the empire. Okay? Dismantling the warfare state, dismantling the national security state. Cold War is over. Dismantling NATO, or at least getting out of it. You see, because it's the warfare state and the welfare state that are sending this country into bankruptcy. And they're sending this country into moral debauchery, into a denigration of conscience, where the conscience is frozen within the individual, where the conscience is unable to recognize that torture is wrong, that assassination is wrong, that this is not what goes on in a free country, where the denial of due process is wrong, where the denial of trial by jury is wrong, where you're rounding up people and you're torturing them and you're incarcerating them indefinitely, and just simply because you labeled them a terrorist is wrong. It's immoral. It has no part of a free society. And you got a welfare state over here where it's a plunder-bun society where everybody's trying to live at the expense of everyone else. Everybody's looting and plundering people through the redistribution of the welfare state. It's an immoral system that was brought into existence in large part in the early 20th century, in full bloom in the Franklin Roosevelt administration, expanded by Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon. The warfare state, the national security state that was brought into existence in 1947 and has expanded ever since. Invasions, occupations, sanctions, embargoes. It's got to be brought to a stop. It's the only way. It's the only solution to the future of this country. Not just economically, not just financially, but morally speaking. It's the only way. A restoration of a constitutional republic, a restoration of free markets, of free enterprise, a dismantling of the welfare regulatory state, the warfare state. That's the only way that's going to get our country on a sound moral footing where we restore peace and prosperity and harmony to our land. It's the only way it's going to work. And that's, of course, what we libertarians are all about. That's why we've got to continue fighting for these principles, because they're the only way out. They're the only way out for ourselves, for our families, for our communities, for our nation. And if we keep doing that, then people at least have an opportunity to say there's a way out. We're not trapped with this welfare warfare paradigm. We can break free of it. We can dismantle it. We can restore freedom, economic liberty, a constitutionally limited republic to our land. That's the show. I won't be with you next week. I'll be over in Reno. Hope you come on over and join us for the conference, and plan to be with you in a couple weeks. Thanks so much for watching, and have a nice weekend.